Are you trying to establish your brand as a thought leader? Start a podcast, invite industry experts to be guests on your show, and watch your brand become the prime resource for decision makers in your industry. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I am your host for today's episode, Nikki Ivy with Sweetfish Media. Guys, I've got with me today Dave Mattson, who is CEO and president of Sandler Training. Of course, Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited. As we spoke about offline, I've got a lot of folks who I'm just personally friends with there in the sales community that cannot wait to hear your insights today. No pressure. So we're going to be talking about identifying blind spots to elevate your sales performance. But Dave, before we get into all of that, I'd love it if you would just share with us a little bit of background on yourself and what you and the folks at Sandler have been up to these days.
Sure. So Sandler, we've been in business for 50 years. I'm in 31 different countries. And we train 31,000 people a year, believe it or not. So there's an awful lot of leadership and salespeople coming through. And if I break it into buckets, Nikki, from a sales perspective, we help people improve sales, increase margin, making sure that we've set this stage where we've got customers that are super happy that we could do more business with, right? Customer success. And on the management side, certainly finding great people, onboarding, coaching, and then what I'll call pipeline hygiene, right? Because as a leader, we're probably the least trained group of people out there. And we all have this swag system. We see a $30 million pipe. We know that's not true. So we tell upper management, hey, guess what? That's 18 million. And we get good at that. The real problem is we got garbage in our system. So depending on who we work with, it's great. We've got about 265 training centers locally. So larger companies ask us to go to them, the LinkedIns and the Salesforces and things like that. And the smaller organizations that can't afford that billion-dollar budget, they come to us, to our training centers. And that's really kind of cool because you're sitting with other leaders and other salespeople. And for the first time, you realize you're not the only one who's got call reluctance, or you're not the only one who's made bad hires. And it's easier to solve somebody else's problems versus saying, well, that would never work in my business. So that really has propelled this 20 times investment that entrepreneurs have. And especially with startups, cash is precious, right? And they look at it as an investment. Most entrepreneurs are with us for at least 7 years, and they never have a budget called training. So we really have to make sure that we hit a home run for them, and we do. So thanks for having me.
Of course. And so let's get into this. First, I want to know why it's important to identify these blind spots. And just by definition, you don't know that you have them. So talk about the why and the how, and then we'll get into what they actually are here in a second.
Okay. So if I use the blind spots, think about a driving analogy for a second. If you're like me, there are times, so even if I'm focused, I look over and there's a car there, I didn't even see it. But that doesn't mean I'm a bad driver. It just means I was focused on something else. If I use that analogy and bring it to business, so these blind spots that we've uncovered, they're in every organization. And much like your lawn where we have weeds popping up, even though you fixed them 3 weeks ago, here they are again. Entrepreneurs and leaders think that they've solved the blind spot and they go on to something else. But what happens is, without reinforcement and constant inspection, as you bring in more people and as you pay attention to something else, these blind spots pop up again. And these blind spots are holding us back from hockey sticking our revenue to where it needs to be. And these, in my opinion, and through a ton of research, this is out of our latest book, organizational excellence. We have identified that these are the things that are holding organizations, holding leaders back from really being the organization that they have projected themselves to be, that they want to be, right? Mm-hmm. Because I'm sure they're working hard. They've got good people. They're trying to figure out how to scale, and they've got great product, although I never think product is the reason why you're going to be successful. This is the stuff that kind of holds us back.
Yeah, for sure. And especially this first one that I want to talk about. I can see how, like you said, it's not necessarily that you're a bad driver. You were just focused on something else. I think that's right. A really important way to think about this for this first blind spot, which is improperly onboarding people. So if you are, say, focused on, depending on how many, new incoming classes of salespeople you have, right? Which with startups can just, in Austin, they were just, churning them in right. Literally every other month, right? Every other, week. Mm-hmm. And so if you're focused on ramping the folks that just joined your organization, right? Getting them to their sales goals, for instance, 2 classes ago or 1 class ago, then you're probably not focused on onboarding right. the folks that just joined. So talk a little bit about that blind spot, how it plays out for folks.
So I think this is a big one. We train more technology companies than anyone else, and this is always popping up because of what you said. And I think also leaders make the mistake of, once I've brought on an experienced person, my job is done. So they think recruiting is where it ends. And in fairness, that's really not where it ends. It just begins in onboarding. And you find out a lot of us, if we don't treat interviewing and hiring as a science, we do go by gut. Right. And so how do I know if I've made a bad decision? How do I know? So let's go to the negative part first. How do I know I've made a bad decision? Well, chances are they've missed their first quota, whatever that is. And for some of us, it's 6 months out, a year out, depending on sales cycles and what you're selling. And as a leader, I've put what I believe is a ton of time into this individual, but they fell short. So do I get rid of them? No. You know what most people do? Well, they rationalize and they say they're very close. I've put some time into them. I see improvement. I think they'll do better next time. And, it just kind of perpetuates itself. Very few leaders track the time to hire to the time of profitability. And you really need to do that as a startup, and you need to do that as a leader, because it's your job to shrink that time. So onboarding, in my mind, has 4 steps. If you want to really make sure that your people are up and running, self-sufficient as quickly as possible. You want me to share the steps, Nikki?
Yes, my ears are open.
Okay, so step number 1 is you have to create a list of all the things that you want your salesperson to be successful at. And I'm not saying, your PTO time and your HR policies aren't important, but put that aside for a second. Let's just focus on a sales example. Make a complete list of things that you want them to be great at. So maybe value props, 30-second commercials, competitive landscape, whatever the case may be, right? And you could do this with your team. You don't have to do it on your own.
Sure.
What's the list? On average, there's going to be about 50 things. Second step, put them in the order of priority. So I may not have to do a QBR if I don't have any clients. So that would go later in the scale. I probably would say, here's my prospecting call. Here's the company products and services. So you would put them in the order of priority that I would need to know. And so that's important. Now, here's the third one, which is where we all fall apart. Where does that information reside? Because you've got to give them an example. So if you worked for me, Nikki, I said, hey, guess what? You need to know a 30-second commercial. So I'm going to talk to you next week. I'd like to hear yours. All right, well, that's good. But guess what? You have no idea what it is, right? So adults learn by imitation and illustration. Right. So I have to, as a leader, saying, Nikki, a 30-second commercial is really important. Here's a sample of what I'd like you to use. Here's a written sample, script. Here's an audio file of somebody actually doing it, depending on how people learn. Now, if you look at your 50 things that you came up with, chances are you don't have a lot of those things. So that's your first signal that, my people have huge gaps and they're making stuff up, right? And, so you go and hire experienced people, you stole them from somebody else and you think, oh, that's it. Well, guess what? You've got like 50 cultures in your company now. So give them an example. And that way they can practice, they can mimic. And when I know that that's your 30-second commercial that you've said makes my company successful, and I master it, then I've got this confidence and conviction that, hey, I've got the tools to succeed early on, versus here's a 7-inch manual we call our sales ops, learn this and you'll be great. I don't think so.
Right.
That's not how it works. So here's step 4. And this is how you create a culture of accountability as well. Step 4 is test it out. So I would say, all right, well, the order of priority, here's what I think you as a new employee should know. And you don't have to be a master at it, but you should have this, conversational understanding in week 1, week 2, week 3, all the way down for the year. So I would come to you at the end of the first week and I'd say, hey, Nikki, listen, I know 30-second commercial. I'll use that as an example. 30-second commercials on the list for this week. Let me hear yours. Now you have to give it back to me. Now, what is this doing? Well, let's think about it from your perspective. You're practicing all week long because I'm your leader. So you want to make sure that you've got it down pat versus doing stuff that's busy work that you think you're being productive, but it's not really on things that you need to be successful. And so that's great. And it builds confidence because then the next week we keep doing it. You also create this culture of accountability. Here's what I expect. Now I'm testing it, which is awesome because as I do CEO coaching, I tell you in the top 10 list is always accountability. How do I create that within my company?
Right.
But here's a side step, Nikki. The side benefit is what happens if I hire a top producer? I mean, an absolute stud or studette. And I say, here it is for week 1. And you'd say, absolutely. Here's my 30-second commercial, Dave. Boom, 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 boom. Hey, would you like to do the second week? I've got my prospecting call down. I've got my competitive link. You're always ahead, which I think is super cool. And that's what top producers are doing. They're way ahead. Think about martial arts, right? You can go as fast or as slow as you want in the martial arts business. You don't have to wait to be a black belt for 16 years. You could do it in X amount of time. So I, as a top producer, am always going to be moving forward. But what happens when we've got somebody who, let's say, shouldn't have been hired, right? Now, let's do this. I call you and I say, hey, it's time for your 30-second commercial. And I'll hear something like, Dave, I got a little sick this week, can't do it. And you dodge me. Or it's just horrific. If it's horrific, I can coach and train, right? But if you're dodging me, which by the way happens more times than not, then I have to say, I don't have to wait a year to see if they're going to make quota. This person is unwilling, because that's your job as a leader. Find people who are willing and able. This person they may be able, but they're unwilling to do what it takes to succeed at my company. You have to go. And that's why it's important.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The willingness is key, right? I had one of my earliest sales jobs. I was a salesperson for a State Farm insurance agent. And I said to him, I was his first hire. And he stole me. He stole me from the apartment leasing job, actually. He came in and written an apartment and was like, you should work for me, actually. No, but no. And I said, yeah, I can, this sounds good. Like, I can do this. You need me to call all these people a day and ask them these questions and see what's up. Yeah, I can do that. And he goes, yes, but will you? And it was one of the most sort of impactful questions I've been asked in my career, and one that frankly, at times I had to struggle with. But what you're talking about in terms of that particular blind spot, right? The improperly onboarding folks leads into this next one when it comes to not knowing how to coach. Because what I've seen more often than not is sort of the opposite scenario of what you just described. It's not the willingness. People come into a lot of the time to these, B2B SaaS startups with a high level of motivation and willingness, whether it's because they're working for someone who they've heard good things about, or they like the organization, or they like the perks, or they like that they're not waiting tables anymore, whatever it is, right? So they come in with the willingness, but you broke down at least 4 different metrics that folks are looking for to coach on, right? In terms of getting folks up to speed. What happens a lot of the time, though, is that time frame is 1 month to 3 months, and it's only the one metric, which is do they hit quota? And I think that people might be leaning on that because the sales managers are also new and may not know how to coach. Right. So you tell me what you've seen as far as that's concerned, and talk a little bit about that blind spot of not knowing how to coach.
Well, the facts are most of our sales force isn't going to make quota, right? And if we really sit and look in ourselves in the mirror, that really does have to do with poor coaching and poor sales leadership as well, because either they shouldn't have been here or we can't help them get to the next stage. So, and I think that most sales leaders come into that role coming out of the sales world, right? And I'll use that as an example, although, you may have a product person coming as a sales leader. But for the most part, what happens is the entrepreneur, the leader, looks out on the troops because Sally, as the sales leaders left, now they're saying to themselves, oh my goodness gracious, I'm going to have to pick up all this slack. Who's going to do this? I look out and I say, Bill, he's the stud. And I go say, Bill, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to replicate everything that you do with the rest of the team. So you are a new sales leader. And so they're off and running. Now, I'm sure that doesn't happen with most of your listeners, but it happens a lot, right? And so here's what they do. If you think about it, you go to the sales leader and now you need some coaching. And so this will be reactive coaching. You say, hey, listen, I'm going on a call. Here's the situation. What should I do? And they'll jump in because they're in the middle of something, right? The number one complaint with sales leaders, time compression. I don't have time, because we measure the time it's going to take to invest in something, but we never measure the time it takes me to clean up all my messes. That's never tracked for some reason. So you come in and I say, okay, Nikki, here's what you do. You do this, and this. Now you leave, you've got your information, and I feel like you can even see my chest expand, right? I still got it. Boy, do I still have it, right? And that's not coaching though, right? Because what happens is if you're a sales leader and you find your people asking the same question lots of times, you're not coaching. So what you have to do is to create almost an event. I always think that there's proactive and reactive. So reactive is, hey, you're asking for help. Proactive is, we're going to create, and we can even use our onboarding stuff. What is it that we want them to be great at? And let's start coaching to make sure, A, are they willing and able? And if you'd like, I'm happy to send you the top 10 coaching areas that sales leaders should know. Happy to send it. If you'd like to post it, happy to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's really where you kind of are. But I'll tell you, because I know we don't have a lot of time, the thing that you could do as a coach is to ask great questions like a doctor, right? Because the doctor probably knows what your problem is, but they still ask a lot of questions. And the more questions and more self-discovery, and the more willing I am to actually make a change. But role play is the number one thing that you should be doing as a coach. So because it's self-discovery, and if let's assume that I showed up on a call and I set no agenda, I just kind of showed up and threw up all over the place. And I thought that was an awesome call, right? And as a coach, I would say, hey, we didn't set an agenda. Let's talk a little about that. Let me show you how it may have looked if we set an agenda. And I actually become the salesperson. You become the prospect, and I show it to you. And then we kind of talk about it. And then you get to do it back to me a couple of different times in a very safe environment. You are more apt to, at your next call, do what we talked about because you've practiced, you've seen it, you've mimicked it, versus, okay, Nikki, you do this, and this. It'll be awesome. And you leave, I have no idea. And by the way, when it doesn't work, when I say do this, and this, who's to blame? I bet you 100% of the time it's going to be, that sales leader, bad coaching, man. They didn't know what to do. That's why they're a leader, because they can't sell. It's terrible. So if you can create a culture of role play within your sales organization, your numbers will go through the roof. And that's probably one of the lost arts that's so easy to do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's great. And I want to make sure we do hit these last two. Let's combine them, though. They do kind of play into exactly what you're talking about. Having a common sales language and, capturing best practices, right? Those two do go hand in hand. And I've seen it. They are a legitimate blind spot for a lot of folks, especially at startups like we were talking about before. Dig into that a little bit for us.
Sure. Real quick, I think most organizations, if they sat their sales force in a room and said, everyone take out a piece of paper, write down the steps that you follow from the time that we're in client development prospecting to the time that we're, selling additional products and services to happy customers, what do? I would bet you my paycheck that there's no consistency in that room. Everybody's doing something different, which means you can't coach, which means that your funnel has to be filled with garbage because everyone's calling it different things. So that would be your health check. If you find out that that is true, and I will bet you it is true, then you can fix this by simply getting your sales force in a room and say, group, what do we do? Step 1 and step 2, step 3, and then create a common methodology. Hey, do I love if you would accept Sandler? Sure. But the fact of the matter is you could do this on your own. Every other part of the organization has a common language. Accountants, your accountant could talk to my accountant, and I promise you they would know what they're saying. But sales, for some reason, is always considered, this art, but it really is science.
Yeah.
Listen, salespeople aren't born; we're made. So we need a process to follow. That's just kind of simple. Now, if I fast forward to the playbook, you should be capturing a playbook. There's a lot of talent in your organization, and no one individual is great at everything, and so we're getting into the sports season now. Every sports team has a playbook. I don't care if you make $38 million. You're not in a huddle, if we use football, and say, okay, listen, you're all highly paid. You're very experienced. On the count of three, do what you want. Break. It's not what happens. So if you're joint selling with product specialists and engineers, you need a playbook so we all know what we're kind of doing. And I can take the best of the best from Mary, who's awesome at getting referrals, and now I can mimic her. And so if you create a virtual playbook, which is examples of people doing what it takes to succeed at your company, it's fantastic. And you, as a sales leader, don't have to do all the heavy lifting. Let's create that list and let those in your sales force kind of step up and say, hey, I'm awesome at that, which gives them, by the way, a great stroke, because now they're contributing, they're seen as an expert in that area, and it really does work. So if you can get your sales methodology down with your playbook, again, hockey stick revenues right around the corner.
That's right. You gave me so much just then. I could fill a whole other podcast with just the conversation on whether or not sales is an art or a science, and all the ways that it's probably both. And what I love is you took these stands, like this is this, and here's why. Because I think that's something that people are kind of moving away from.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Taking positions.
Taking positions for sure. So thanks for that. Now I've got time here on my end to ask you this last question. And I think that if I don't, I got some folks to be mad at me. We've done a good job here picking your brain and seeing what we can get out of it. I have to know what you're putting in it, Dave. What are you reading? What are you listening to? What learning resources are you engaging with that inform your approach and that have just got you excited these days?
Well, the good news is I'm surrounded by 400 awesome trainers who have continued new ideas all the time. So I'm listening to a ton of, sales and sales leadership podcasts, whether they're Sandler or non-Sandler, because I'm just, a junkie, reading a lot. And, some of the things that are exciting me, technology, with AI is changing. There's a lot of stuff going on in the artificial intelligence world. But, we have this LMS that's got 800, 900 podcasts. And, there's a lot of stuff in there. The problem is you have to actually log in and access this stuff. So what we've developed, which really excites me now, is voice activation. I could say, I'd like to hear Dave's latest podcast, and I don't have to log into anything. All I have to do is go into Alexa, and up comes my podcast with you, Nikki. Right?
Oh, wow.
Or I can say, who am I calling on today? Oh, you're calling on Nikki. It's a 9:00 appointment. Oh, okay. Well, what's her disc style? Bum, 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 bum. What's the agenda? And I'm pulling that out of CRM. So now, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in, training us to say, Alexa, play Tom Petty. Alexa, turn off my lights. Alexa, do this. Now it's hit our world, and we've made that transition. And I have to tell you, for me, it's changed everything for me, because I don't have to download anything. I don't have to log on to anything. I just say, I'd like the latest book from Sandler. Hey, I'd like to listen to something from, Ziegler or whatever we're listening to. And it pops up, and it's super cool.
I love it. Thanks for sharing that. I know that, like me, we talked about before, plenty of folks out there listening are fans of yours and might want to connect with you. Let us know how they can do that.
No, they can certainly go to LinkedIn and connect with us. They can find me on Sandler.com. And if your listeners want to come as my guest to sit in and watch a program, just look up one of the local training centers. We've got 265 of them, and say, hey, I listened to Dave and Nikki. I'd like to come in and watch a program. Free. Just go in, learn, absorb. Hopefully you get better. Eventually somebody will come back and say, hey, I went to that Sandler course a couple of years ago. It was awesome. Let's get engaged. But really, if I can teach it to you, there's no strings attached. Just go as my guest, because that's how I got hooked 30 years ago. I was a client. I'm introverted. I didn't think salespeople were, made. I thought they were born. I said, there's no way I'm going to make it here. And I sat in a program and changed my life. So hopefully we can change others as well.
Perfect. Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. Guys, go out and do this. I'm going to see if I can find one close to me out here in Jacksonville. Because, that's one of our values here at Sweetfish Media, is to never stop learning. Dave, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show and laying all this out for us. I would love to have you on again sometime here in the future. to talk about some of the other blind spots or some of the ways to succeed at anything that you've laid out in some of your other content. Thank you so much, Dave.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.